So hello and welcome back to another edition of Food Safety Office Hours. This is a beginning of a series that we're offering this summer on the safety of low moisture foods. But this first session is a topic that is relevant broadly to the food industry, so for low moisture food producers and beyond. And that is navigation of supply chain disruptions. And so we're going to start with brief presentations from two professors here at Cornell. So first up, we have Aaron Adalja, an assistant professor of food and beverage management who works in applied economics and policy. And he will be giving an overview of some of the changes in trade and the impact on food supply chains. And then we'll transition to a presentation from Professor Martin Wiedmann, who has expertise in food safety. And Martin is going to discuss the ways in which those changes to supply chains can impact food safety. So following the presentations, Aaron and Martin will be joined by our industry experts, Mark Nisbet, Director of Product Development at Mars Wrigley, and Hazel from Totosian, Senior Director, Global Food Applications at Ingredion. So that is the plan for today. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to you, Aaron.
You're currently muted, Aaron.
Thank you. Thanks, Abby. And thank you everyone for joining. Give me 1 second and just share some slides. Oops. All right. So what I wanted to do today was spend about 15 minutes kind of providing an overview of what the 2025 US trade policy changes look like, at least to the extent that we know now. Again, it's as all of you may know, it's a little bit of a moving target, but try to shed some light on how those trade policies are affecting food supply chains and where we might start to see disruptions. So I'll get started. What I would like to do is provide you first with a brief overview of kind of what's going on with tariffs. There's a lot of stuff that's still in progress and slated to change over the next couple months, but you can at least see where we're at. Talk a little bit about where I see the most exposure in terms of food categories, and how that might play into some costs and operational shocks. Another piece of our trade policy and the potential disruptions are on the exporting side. There's certain export markets that might be affected as well. And then we'll kind of close up with talking about how this layers on to some of the existing supply chain disruptions that we've had in the past, and then think about where we should be thinking or where we should be looking to make sure that we remain agile around this type of thing. So let's talk very briefly about kind of where we are at a glance, and I'll put these all up and then I'll talk through them really quickly. Basically, you know, as of earlier this year, we started with a pretty much across the board 10% baseline tariff, and it looks like that's essentially here to stay. So unless exempted, basically what that means is that every shipment, be it whatever it may be, coming into the United States is going to face at least that extra cost. So the other thing to consider here is, where does a lot of the food that we source in the United States come from? Well, a lot of that comes from North American supply chains, and that is actually where some of the biggest immediate hits are being felt. So 25% on Canada and Mexico. So sourcing things like produce, beer, glass containers, metal packaging is really becoming more expensive for food manufacturers. There are some other things that are on the pike, coming down the pike over the next month. In the EU and Vietnam, they've got clear cliff dates, by which I mean certain products coming from those countries are either going to be subject to much higher tariffs if trade talks break down in a couple weeks, or they may be going the way of more like the 10% tariff. So we don't really know yet, but If you think about what's being sourced from the EU and Vietnam, it might be olive oil, it might be chocolate, it might be coffee. These types of things are maybe potentially at risk when it comes time for some of these trade talks. And then the last thing I'll mention is China, which is another major source of many types of products that we source in the United States. So it's already at 55%. And it doesn't really look like that's necessarily going to change. So things that we source from China, whether it be spices or garlic, are already seeing those increased costs. So long story short, as we think about US trade policy in 2025, we've got a bit of a moving target. There's potential for things to go up or go down over the next year in terms of how those tariffs get enacted. But ultimately, we should be thinking about how manufacturers are going to realign their procurement strategies to basically build in resiliency and flexibility around these around these uncertain tariffs. So what categories are most affected? So this is my sort of quick list of the things that I think are potentially going to be the most potentially affected. And I'll be really curious to have, once we get to the conversation, to talk about where others see this going. But these 6 buckets kind of represent, or these 6 categories, the bulk of imported ingredients and finished goods that drive, whether it's CPG or food service menus. So you think about things like fresh produce. There's a significant portion of fresh produce that is sourced from Mexico. We've got things like coffee and tea that are sourced from Vietnam, sourced from Brazil, Colombia. Sorry, I skipped seafood. Seafood, a lot of our seafood comes from China and Southeast Asia. So there's some risks there. Spices, cocoa, and vanilla. The key thing here is there really are no US substitutes. We can't grow cocoa in the United States. We can't grow coffee in the United States. A lot of the spices we import as well because they don't grow in the United States. So that's an important thing to consider. Cooking oils and sugars. We now are starting to source a reasonable amount of cooking oils and sugars from Europe and Southeast Asia as well. It's not the majority, but it's a significant minority of our sourcing. And then the last category, beer, wine, and spirits. We source a tremendous amount of beer, wine, and spirits from Mexico, and that is now subject to significantly higher rates than they used to be. So the other piece of this puzzle is thinking about how these costs are going to layer on. And one important thing to think about with regards to that is that every layer of the manufacturing process and the supply chain process now has a tariff line. So we're talking about ingredients, we're talking about packaging, we're talking about logistics. Every one of those things is potentially going to be affected. So ingredient costs, of course, are going up. Packaging is a really important one. Steel and aluminum tariffs are an important factor when you think about canned foods, whether it's steel canned food or aluminum canned food or drink. Those are being affected. And manufacturers at some point obviously have no option but to pass those increases to wholesalers and retailers, which of course ultimately results in, or at least partially contributes to, this larger food inflation and inflationary environment we've had over the past 4 years. Now, there are some operational concerns that I think are worth considering when we think about how this trade policy affects what goes on within the 4 walls of the manufacturing facility. So first off, supplier switching and qualification delays. One thing that we've observed is manufacturers or I should say food companies are thinking about, can we source ingredients from different locations to circumvent some of these tariffs? So can we switch suppliers? Can we essentially bring on board new suppliers that meet our conditions quickly in order to avoid a tariff? There's obviously going to be a lot that goes along with that, with onboarding a new supplier. So there's some delays that's creating in terms of actually getting those suppliers onboarded. We've already seen issues around stockpiling versus perishability. So for perishable foods, which I know is not the main topic of this office hour, but for perishable foods, there's obviously a limit to what you can do in terms of stockpiling. But to give you an example, some firms air freighted berries to beat the April 5th deadline, and they ended up maxing out space. They ended up maxing out warehouse space. And for fresh goods, that buffer inventory idea is a little bit of a limited, it has some limitations. So thinking about how procurement happens, the timing of procurement, especially when we're in an environment here where trade policy is changing somewhat rapidly, timing when things are procured can have really significant effects on the bottom line. The other thing is when products arrive at port, there's new bottlenecks that are arising. So a lot of new paperwork with new tariffs means that things might be delayed. As ports get clogged, we might start to see similar supply chain delays like we did 5 years ago. Things might take longer to get processed. If it's a perishable product, of course, there's some significant concerns there. If it's not a perishable product, that still means that we might be seeing empty shelves, or we might be seeing overcrowded storage spaces. It really kind of depends. It could play out in a number of ways. So lead time is an important factor here. Thinking about how to essentially remain flexible around how things are being brought into the United States to make sure that we have a consistent supply and we're able to meet demand. The other point I want to mention here is that if we had one set of tariffs or one set of trade policies and those policies perpetuated, indefinitely, that's a fairly easy target for us to think about. If it's stable, if it's not moving, we can plan for it, right? But the risk here is that there's a lot of uncertainty. Things are changing rapidly. We saw changes happen over the course of a 72-hour period instead of over the course of years. So the risk is often pricier than the changes in policy themselves. This makes planning very, very challenging. So shorter contracts, thinking about, okay, do I want to sign that 5-year contract with this new supplier in this particular country? Or do I want to think about short-term contracts, contingency sourcing? All of this makes things much more complicated for a supply chain manager. Those who are thinking about extra inventory and about sort of creating buffers, that creates ripple effects in the rest of the company. Things like tying up working capital that could be used for other capital projects. So it really kind of trickles down to other parts of the company. Foreign exchange markets are another factor. We've got all kinds of things happening with currency markets, which again, if you're a CFO right now, it's a very, very challenging time. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of moving parts going on, and it's making it a little bit difficult to really try to think about how we plan. In fact, the latest sentiment study I saw suggested that 1/3 of CFOs cite trade as the #1 risk right now. I want to spend a second talking a bit about how the response, the international response to U.S. trade policy, and how that might have some implications for food manufacturers as well. So retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports is a concern that I think hasn't quite come to fruition yet, but it's something to have on the horizon. So China, for example, imports quite a lot of U.S. soy, meats, and grains. So it's kind of a two-sided sword here, or a double-edged sword. We've got tariffs on products coming into the US, so we're paying more for inputs. But as there are retaliatory tariffs that are enacted in other countries, that also shrinks demand for our exports. So there's a lot going on, and how that plays out really is something we don't quite know the answer to yet. But it seems like, you know, over the course of the next 6 months, we're going to see some of that happen. So China was one example. Canada and Mexico have started thinking about targeting certain products that we export to their countries. The EU hasn't done anything yet, but they have a list ready. So potentially, depending on what happens on July 9th, we might see certain exports to the EU being tariffed in the EU. And what does that mean? You know, so for growers in the United States, it might mean that farm gate prices fall if export demand drops. You know, rural plants are will start to feel that pinch. So it's something to think about as this trade policy continues to evolve. And then I'll kind of finish up here over the next couple minutes. I just want to talk quickly about why, you know, evolving trade policy alone is a challenge, but this layers on to other factors that we need to kind of think about. And that's we already have a fairly challenging environment to plan around with other factors that have been affecting the supply chain over the last half decade. You can think about other parts of the supply chain, not just food manufacturing, but think about things like fertilizer tariffs. You know, as we tariff fertilizer coming from Canada, that falls outside of certain exemptions, that might cause farm costs to rise. Steel and aluminum duties, again, packaging, very, very important factor in CPG. That's going to start to increase costs for packaging and transport. There's also non-tariff barriers that are important to consider. These affect logistics, extra inspections, quotas, things of that nature that are starting to be talked about that we need to consider. And that all sort of layers on to issues we were already seeing with the supply chain. Labor shortages are certainly not something that's new to any of us, but now that we layer on this extra pressure, it can create some compounding effects. And weather shocks as well, again, these are things that happen on a regular basis. It just creates one more variable that we need to plan for. And then the last piece to mention with regards to other factors is that consumers are right now are also feeling pressure in their wallets. So there's some trading down that we're starting to observe, where consumers are trading down to value brands amid food inflation. So as prices go up, as tariffs have to be passed down to retailers, we may see more shifts in consumer behavior or consumer demand as a result of that. So I think I'm kind of getting close to time, so I'll just quickly touch on a couple last things just to close up, and then hand it over to Martin. So some of the strategies or strategic responses we've been seeing: diversification and hedging. So a lot of food manufacturers are already starting to map tier 2 suppliers, pre-qualifying substitutes, tracking exemption windows. You know, the real leaders here are thinking about trade policy the same way we think about weather. So monitoring it constantly, adapting quickly. That sounds like a daunting task. I certainly don't envy the role of those who are doing that right now, but it's really kind of where we're at with trade policy. Re-engineering products, R&D teams are thinking about how can we reformulate products to reduce our reliance on imported spices, cutting spice costs, you know, boosting domestic herb and flavor enhancers. A little bit longer term, local for local production. Can we set up plants in local countries to avoid border duties? That's a much longer term prospect, but it's something that's on the on the table. And then lastly, thinking about policy windows, thinking about waivers, thinking about how can we potentially exempt products in order to avoid tariffs. And I'll close there. I'll just put this up as the key takeaways, and then I'll hand it over to Martin so we don't lose time. But again, tariffs are certainly here to stay. Volatility is a big risk, more so than the price itself. The name of the game right now is just resiliency and flexibility. It's really the main consideration that's happening right now in a supply chain manager's mind. All right. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Hopefully that gave you a reasonable overview of how trade policy is kind of playing out in the food space. I'll hand it over to Martin to talk about where the food safety risks are. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. And what you will see is that a lot of my slides and my comments will really build on what Aaron mentioned here, and some new thoughts that I just had as I listened to you, Aaron. So let's talk about more specific impacts on food safety. In this intro, you'll see a lot of things you've heard from Aaron, but maybe a little bit more granularity and more specific. I mean, yeah, obviously, with these disruptions and the volatility Aaron discussed, transportation delays and infrastructure issues going to become a bigger issue in my mind. Labor shortages, Aaron mentioned. I think we will see efforts to, replace humans with AI, and that might go well in some cases and might not go super well in some cases. Scarcity of any types of materials, not just foods, but Aaron mentioned steel. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper, even supplies for lab tests. I'm going to give you some examples of where, supply chain disruptions impacted lab tests, reliability of lab tests, and how that impacts food safety. Changes in regulatory oversight and public health surveillance. I mean, I can't keep track of who FDA fired and hired back and what they're doing with international inspections. Again, same volatility that Aaron mentioned, it will have impact on the reliability of these international supply chains and the food safety assurances we have. Profit margins, Aaron covered the changes of onboarding new suppliers and how we need to be fast about it and proactive about it. And then what I'm going to call the non-obvious. I talked about service providers, so labs, lab testing. We take those for granted. We take for granted that they have kits to detect salmonella and listeria, and those kits work. Well, with supply chain disruptions, those kits might suddenly not work as well anymore. We actually seen that during COVID. A lot of false positives, lots of problems. Just not having some of the reagents we think is foundational, sponges to do environmental monitoring. Well, those are low margin products that are not produced in the US often. What's the impact of tariffs going to be in that? Animal feed, and that's where one of Aaron's comments brought up, retaliatory tariffs. So all of a sudden, soy from the US becomes more expensive for China, maybe other parts of Asia. They still have to feed the animals that ultimately gonna become food, or become food ingredients even. What are they gonna use to feed the animals if they don't buy soy? Domestically grown food, where are they getting that food from? What are the risks for heavy metal contamination, other contamination of these products that carry over into the product that we're sourcing? I think something people don't think about. I'm a veterinarian by training. That's something that always strikes me. So what are the food safety risks associated? Obviously microbiological. It's not just pathogens. That's probably the first thing we think about, but also spoilage risks. And they could, they're not food safety, but they're business risks. Chemical risks, adulteration, degradation and changes in composition, adulteration. Sometimes it's just economic adulteration. We give you something that's cheaper, but very often economic adulteration comes along with true food safety hazards. And I'll give you some examples of them. Often these chemical and microbiological risks can have the same root cause, right? I'm adding an unapproved ingredient for economic adulteration to reduce my cost. And it happens to have chemicals in there because no one's testing it, but think heavy metals, but might also have salmonella in it. And, one day it might have chemicals, one day it might have pathogens in it. So often the root causes can be very similar, and more these mega trends that Aaron mentioned. So what's more specifically, what are some of the disruption-related causes of micro risks? Unapproved new ingredients, raw materials, substitutions. As that we will see that expensive ingredients and spices are high on my list, that Aaron mentioned. We're gonna do some there's gonna be some economic alteration where we replace 5% of an expensive spice with something of similar color, and that doesn't go through an approved food facility. Who knows what's going to be introduced with that? Production of unapproved and unaudited facilities, so facility switching. If the cost pressure comes down, we're going to move to cheaper facilities that might be in areas that might not have been audited, that might not have the same infrastructure. And I think it's pretty common some people on this office hour may have been in China and other places. My gut feeling being there's one facility that's there for auditing, and there are 5 other ones that are there for production into the US. Every audit goes to the one facility, but the product you get may or may not come from that audited facility. It comes from other facilities that have less good infrastructure, less stringent practices, and therefore can produce cheaper. That's one of the realities we have to face. Labor shortages, increased staff turnover. It can result cutting of corners, sanitation, whether it's domestically or abroad. Also may impact audits, third-party audits, government audits, or simply that audits are conducted by less qualified workforce. Chemical risks, a lot of its first two we already covered. Packaging, issues with packaging can play a role in that. Labeling errors, if we have to change ingredients more rapidly, are we really paying attention to the labeling, or are we still using the label we always had? That's another risk. And obviously we all know allergen recalls often due to mislabeling are one of the biggest reasons of recalls. So a few examples. Some of you might remember the cumin peanut issue. So cumin was adulterated, economically adulterated with peanut, which makes sense. You have an expensive spice, you grind up something cheap that's about the same color, add it to it at 5 to 10%, profit margins go up. Problem is, of course, if someone consumes a peanut allergy, we have a major problem. I think the risk of seeing more of that is clearly there, and it's not just going to be limited to cumin, and it's not just going to be peanuts. So we're going to find whatever is similar in color and doesn't have an obvious flavor effect where people can taste it, or sometimes people can taste it, but not the average person. You're going to see more of that. If anyone's in the sort of botanicals or so, a little bit of grass dried down, added to something that's green already. Hey, cheap way to boost your profit margin, let's be honest. Chobani just announced or had an interview with Hamdi that said, make America healthy again. What is the impact of that on risks for food makers? And, we talked, Aaron, I don't think you've mentioned that, but we talked about pressure to reformulate, with regard to colors. Where are we going to get these colors from? Where are we going to get those ingredients from? Do we have enough time to make sure the facilities are approved and the products are safe and we don't introduce any unwanted hazards? I think we're gonna see pathogens we haven't worried about. Bacillus cereus is a spore form. It survives heat treatment in the US. Most people don't seem to care about it much. Europe, completely different story. We might start to see organisms that we don't think of as pathogens or causing disease now being introduced with some of those new ingredients and new products. What do I mean about? Lactic acid bacteria. Many of us have heard about them. We tend to think of them, oh, they're healthy. They're probiotics, etc. Well, not quite so fast on that. There are many, many different types of lactic acid bacteria. There are other organisms that are going to be used for fermentations to produce some of these, new ingredients. Do we really have the processes in place to assure the safety or the risk assessment, do an appropriate risk assessment of these compounds? There's a paper that, people have happily, I'm going to say, ignored, where we looked at a common probiotic and people did an analysis of bacteremia, so essentially a bloodstream infection. And what they found, bloodstream infections with lactobacillus, the ones that consumed a probiotic, 6 out of 552 consumed that probiotic. The other hand, 2 out of 21,000 did not. So substantially increased risk of bacteremia due to lactobacillus if you consume probiotic. Okay, be considering that and considering the other ingredients, the other microbes that might be used in production of that enough? Maybe, maybe not. I think it's a little bit of a blind spot that we need to worry about, or at least consider. Okay. Service provider related risks, again, something I think is a little bit under the radar. Testing labs experience the same pressures. Labor becomes more costly. Supplies become more costly. Yeah, sometimes they have long-term contracts with price guarantees. They cannot move them through. So as I said, during COVID, we had examples of test kits being faulty, throwing false positives or false negatives. In some countries, there's a technique known as dry labbing. And those of you who have not heard that, that's the word to remember. You can impress your friends on dinner conversation. What is dry labbing? Is I send a sample to the lab looks at that sample, say, I don't think that's going to be positive. I could do a $20 test, or I just look at it and write a negative COA. Where is it done commonly in microbiology? Environmental monitoring, taking a swab from an environment, a sponge. I can look at that sponge and see that sponge is clean. I can just write a negative result there. I do that for 2 out of 100 samples that obviously look like they should be negative. I'm going to make a lot more money. Profit margin increases. So these are the things that will also happen. So that, I would reduce my trust and faith in the COAs, the certificates of analysis, particularly I'm going to get internationally because of lab disruptions. That also contributes to the bigger picture. Thoughts on mitigation and prevention. Aaron already had some really good examples. Yeah, improve supply chain monitoring and review, more random tests. Talked about both the test, the reliability of COAs, and if someone's going to do economic adulteration, I'm sure they're going to make sure that product that was economically adulterated is not tested. They send a clean product to be tested and ship the adulterated product. So leverage untargeted test methods. We've seen this before. Some of the adulteration leads to problems we didn't know. Enter melamine, right? That was put into dairy powder to make sure the tests that determine the levels of proteins ran higher, therefore giving people more money, improving the value of the product. No one knew that melamine was a public health issue, but you can do untargeted tests where you essentially look at a fingerprint of an overall food product that could be chemically through mass spec and other tools, hyperspectral imaging, or it could be genetically through things such as metagenomics. Do those tests every now and then just to have a better idea of when your supply chain, when your ingredients change. It doesn't necessarily tell you what the problem is, but it tells you what you're getting as ingredients right now is different than what used to be and can trigger root cause analysis and further actions. There's going to be a temptation, and I already see it, and there's going to be some true leveraging of AI, artificial intelligence, for review of certificates of analysis, order fulfillment, etc. I think some of these are early signals we need to look at. If we usually order 100 units of an ingredient and we get 100 units, now all of a sudden we get 90 and they're 5 days late regularly, that suggests something is not right. And it suggests we need to dig in deeper. Opportunities for data sharing and previously untapped data sources with less government surveillance, with less testing potentially by FDA, with less effective outbreak detection. Companies should look into how they can share data, because very often we talk about rare events, but it's going to impact each company equally if it's a single supply chain. Talk about reviewing third-party audits, change management. If you do not have a procedure, if you do not have SOPs for change management, now is the time. You're going to see rapid change that's going to happen in some of your facilities where you, if you're in QA, may not know, okay? It's my understanding that SQF is starting to mandate or require procedures for change management, and in this case, I think they're spot on. With all this volatility, we need to be better about identifying when change is going to occur and make sure that change is approved and reviewed and does not occur on the fly. which it will if you're all of a sudden in a situation where you may have to stop production and have to fulfill customer orders. So that to me is a big one that's going to benefit companies, even if none of these problems that Aaron and I foresee will actually impact your facility. Change is permanent. If you're going to have better change management practices, you will be ahead. And we talked about AI. I tried to figure out how good is AI at that. I sort of did an AI search on what are the food safety risks with supply chain disruptions. Honestly, I think Aaron and I are better than AI in this case, which of course, I was sort of convinced of that before. So, you can do it yourself, see what you heard here and see what AI tells you. So obviously lots of possibilities, but I don't think generative AI in particular may not be there with some of those truly more emerging issues. It may be, but my quick review indicated not really. So take-home messages, supply chain challenges, disruptions, and volatility, as Aaron mentioned, are the new realities. I think whatever we do now to address this proactively will help us. Obviously, most of us in the food space sort of have a pretty good idea that we need to look at ingredients and raw material suppliers, but move beyond that. Packaging and equipment, the equipment you buy now, is it made for the same quality compounds? Or do we have shortcuts there? Do we see more foreign material issues? Transportation, labs and third-party auditors. And then, it's time to explore and utilize new tools. Untargeted screening, despite my sort of riff on AI, I think AI can play a substantial role in helping us identify issues earlier, and change management and having procedures for change management. So I hope this was useful. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you both for those presentations. So